So what happens when, the loudest, most visibly religious people in your community are, well, they're the exact same ones driving everyone else away from the faith?
Oh man, it is a staggering contradiction.
Right. I mean, you see people who never miss a public prayer, who wear all the right outward symbols of piety, and yet they're the ones acting with the most cruelty, the most arrogance, and like the most hostility toward anyone who doesn't conform.
Yeah, and it creates this massive crisis of authenticity
Yeah.
because if those external markers of virtue become completely divorced from, actual internal goodness, you kind of start to question the validity of those markers entirely.
Absolutely.
The community just starts to fracture because the very rituals that were supposed to bind people together are instead being used as weapons of social dominance.
And that profound disconnect between the outward symbol of virtue and the inward reality of a person's actions is exactly what we are getting into today. So welcome to our deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, for you listening, we are exploring a really fascinating three-part document. It's titled Allah, Du'a, and the Soul of the Ummah. And for those who might need a quick refresher, Ummah refers to the broader global community of believers.
Right, the global body.
Exactly. So we have this stack of material that reads less like a theoretical textbook and much more like a highly charged, ongoing debate. I mean, it starts with an anonymous original post laying down a theological challenge.
Yeah, really setting the stage.
And then it follows up with this deeply raw, real-world commentary from a reader in Cape Town, South Africa. And finally, it wraps up with a reflective analysis trying to synthesize the whole thing.
It's a very dynamic set of sources, honestly, because it moves from pure theology straight into the messy sociological reality of how humans actually behave.
Very true.
It doesn't just ask what the rules are. It asks, what happens to the human soul when those rules get hijacked by a culture of performance?
Right. And our mission for you, the listener, is to unpack this tension between structured religious ritual and raw private sincerity. We really want to explore what happens when outward displays of faith are weaponized for social control.
Exactly.
But before we get into the weeds, I do need to be crystal clear about our boundaries today. Our goal is to impartially explore the viewpoints contained in this source material. We are not here to endorse any specific side of the communal or theological divides mentioned in the text.
Yeah, that's crucial.
We aren't taking sides on the historical conflicts or the religious interpretations. We are simply here to examine these ideas exactly as they are presented in the documents. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Well, what's fascinating here is to understand how a society corrupts its own religious practices. The anonymous author of the first document argues we have to look at how people have conflated two fundamentally different things,
Okay.
namely Allah and Duʿā. And they aren't just giving us basic dictionary definitions here. I mean, they are making a really specific argument about the weight of these practices.
Right, because assuming you know the basics, that Allah is the structured, fixed-time prayer and Du'a is the personal supplication, the author is really challenging how people actually engage with them.
They are.
They quote Quran 4.103 to establish the, non-negotiable scheduled nature of Allah. But they aggressively push back against the idea that Allah is just some inherited tradition or a mindless physical performance.
Yeah, it's not just going through the motions.
Exactly. They describe it as literal meeting with the Creator, where you declare that God is greater than your ego, your career, and your fears.
And that's where they bring in Quran 29.45, which is really the crux of their argument.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that verse states that true Allah should actively restrain a person from shameful and unjust deeds. It's supposed to be an active, transformative force.
So it actually does something to you.
Right. If you engage in the structure properly, the psychological and spiritual result should be a real change in your moral behavior.
And then they contrast that structure with Duʿā, which is the unscripted, continuous lifeline.
Yeah.
No fixed times, no gatekeepers.
Yeah, none of that.
You do it driving, working, crying. They bring in Quran 2.186, where God says, I am near, and answers the call. And it strikes me that these serve two vastly different human needs.
How do you mean?
Well, it's almost like EOLA is a scheduled, highly important performance review with your boss or your mentor. You show up at a specific time, there's a rigid structure, clear expectations, and it's meant to realign your overarching goals.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
But Du'a is it's like shooting a quick, raw text message to that same mentor at 2 a.m. when you're having a panic attack, just saying, I need help, you need both, but you can't substitute one for the other.
I like the performance review analogy for the scheduling aspect, but it actually falls short in one major critical way that the source points out.
Ooh, how so?
Well, in a corporate performance review, your boss only really sees your metrics, right? You can fake enthusiasm if your numbers are good. But in Allah, the boss sees your internal sincerity. You can't fake the metrics with God.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that is exactly why the text includes that stark warning from chapter 107 of the Quran. It says, "Woe to those who pray, who are heedless of their Allah, those who only show off." The ritual is just utterly void if the heart isn't in it.
Okay, but this brings up a huge question for me, and I kind of want to push back on the text premise here.
Sure, go for it.
The source explicitly claims, based on that Quranic verse, that true awe restrains a person from bad deeds. So if that mechanism is supposedly built into the ritual, why do we constantly see people who strictly observe these 5 daily prayers, who never miss an appointment, and yet they cheat in business?
Right.
They oppress their neighbors, and they spread slander. I mean, the author even points this out as a pervasive reality. How does the text reconcile that glaring contradiction?
It's a great question. The author reconciles it by arguing that the mechanism hasn't failed, the user hasn't actually activated it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, their thesis is that a body can bow while a heart remains entirely arrogant. A tongue can recite while a soul remains asleep. So, if a person's Allah leaves their moral compass unchanged, the author argues you shouldn't blame the divine command.
You blame the execution.
Exactly. You have to conclude that the person hasn't truly, quote-unquote, established the prayer. They are just doing a physical exercise. The ritual has been entirely hollowed out, leaving only the shell.
And that hollow shell is exactly what brings us into the harsh sociological reality of the second document. Because my question about that disconnect is confronted head-on by the commentary from the reader in Cape Town.
Yeah, it really takes a turn there.
It does. We move from theological theory straight onto the pavement.
We do, and this reader offers a fascinating, albeit super painful, sociological observation. They argue that the primary crisis in their community isn't a lack of people praying. It isn't a secular abandonment of faith. The crisis is an absolute, suffocating neglect of sincerity. The community has developed this toxic culture of needing to be seen to be doing.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The contrast the reader draws from their childhood is so vivid. They describe 2 very distinct camps of people.
Yeah, the 2 camps.
On one hand, you had the loud, performative worshipers. These were the people making a massive public spectacle of their Allah and their Duʿā. But the reader describes their actual character as repulsive.
Repulsive, yeah.
They were boastful, they were insulting, they were known to lie and cheat.
Yes, and then you have the other camp, the private, reserved Muslims. The local Cape Town term the reader uses for them is sturvy.
Sturvy.
Right. These were people who deliberately hid their faith. The vocal, loud majority looked down on them, viewing them as almost half Muslims because they weren't publicly performing. But the reader notes that these sturvy individuals were the ones who were actually compassionate.
Wow.
They were just. They treated their families with kindness.
Let's psychoanalyze that for a second. Why would someone feel the need to hide their faith to protect it? I mean, it implies that the public square of that community was so corrupted by performance that the only way to maintain your purity of intention was to completely withdraw from the public eye.
Exactly. It's basically a defense mechanism against what economists call Goodhart's Law.
Remind me what that is.
Goodhart's Law states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Oh, right.
So in a healthy religious community, public prayer is just a measure of one's devotion. But in this toxic environment, the visible act of prayer became the target itself.
It became the currency.
Exactly, the social currency you needed to gain status. Once the public performance became the goal, it ceased to be a measure of actual faith. And the sturvy believers instinctively understood this. They refused to play the game, so they took their faith underground.
And the consequences of this performative culture weren't just spiritual. They were incredibly damaging to the community's intellectual life, too.
Oh, massively.
The commentary highlights how these loud, performative groups harbored a deep hostility toward secular education. They dismissed it using a specific local phrase, Christengeleerdheid, which translates to Christian learning.
Yeah, and we really have to unpack the mechanism behind that hostility. Like, why would a group so obsessed with outward religious performance feel threatened by a kid going to university to study chemistry or engineering?
Why do you think?
It's because secular education teaches critical thinking. It teaches you how to demand evidence, how to identify logical fallacies, and how to question authority.
And they didn't want that.
Not at all. If followers learn to relentlessly question a science textbook, it is only a matter of time before they turn around and question the religious leader's absolute authority. Calling it Christian learning was a deliberate branding exercise to make intellectual curiosity seem like a sin against the faith.
The tragic irony of that is just staggering. I mean, by punishing education, the loud groups actually drove the sincere, educated Muslims away.
Completely backfired.
Yeah. The source notes that many of these educated individuals left to join entirely different groups, specifically mentioning the Baha'is and the Ahmadiyyas. And the implication isn't necessarily that they left for profound theological agreements with those sects.
Right, it wasn't about doctrine.
No, they left because those groups simply behaved in a more civilized manner. They valued education. They had basic good character.
It is a devastating critique. The people shouting the loudest about defending the religion were the ones actively driving sincere seekers out the back door.
Unbelievable.
And then, to maintain their own cognitive dissonance, the loud group simply branded those who left as kafir, or unbelievers. It's a textbook example of authoritarian sociology.
How so?
When religion morphs into mere tribal culture, it attracts the sophists, the politicians, the attention grabbers. The culture becomes entirely about forced conformity, having to do like the rest, and anyone who doesn't conform must be villainized so the group doesn't have to look in the mirror.
And this breakdown of the community is where the third document, the reflective analysis, comes in. It looks at this Cape Town reality and identifies 3 specific fractures that explain how a community devolves from the beautiful ideals of sincere worship into this toxic tribalism.
Right, so the first fracture the analysis identifies is the weaponization of Taqwah.
Taqwah.
Yeah, Taqwah translates roughly to the consciousness or fear of God. It is supposed to be a deeply private spiritual compass, but the text points out that leaders in these performative groups hijack that private fear and weaponize it to extract public obedience.
It reminds me of the most toxic corporate environments I've seen.
Oh, how so?
Well, imagine a company where middle management uses the company's core values, not to inspire their team, but to bully them. Someone says, "Oh, you aren't working a 60-hour week. I guess you just don't believe in our core value of dedication."
Oh, wow. Yes, that's exactly it.
It takes a principle designed for personal growth and turns it into a weapon of extortion. The source notes these leaders use the fear of hell to control property, demand silence, and force submission.
And the theological analysis here is incredibly sharp. It states that coerced worship violates a fundamental constitutional boundary within the faith itself.
It violates the core text.
Yeah, it quotes Quran 2.256, which explicitly states, "There is no compulsion in religion." So by forcing people to pray through social pressure or fear of ostracization, these leaders are robbing their followers of the very thing that makes the prayer valid, free will and sincerity.
Because coerced prayer is fake.
Exactly. A coerced prayer only produces a hypocrite.
Which leads directly into the second fracture, what the text calls the tragedy of anti-intellectualism. Going back to that Cape Town example of branding secular knowledge as Christian learning, the analysis doesn't just call this a mistake, it calls it spiritual suicide.
Because it is a direct violation of the Quran's own commands.
Oh, right.
Yeah, the text brings in Quran 3.191, which explicitly commands believers to reflect deeply on the creation of the heavens and the earth, to study the universe. The analysis argues that knowledge is never inherently Christian or Muslim. It is simply either true or false.
Makes total sense.
When a community punishes curiosity, it destroys its own immune system. The fact that educated Muslims had to flee to other groups just to find basic civilized behavior is presented as a scathing, undeniable indictment of the community's arrogance.
And that arrogance is the bedrock of the third fracture, the illusion of the popular group. This is where Allah completes its dark transformation from a private audience with the Creator into a tribal badge of allegiance.
Yeah, it's pretty grim.
The text is brutal here. It references Islamic tradition to argue that weaponizing prayer like this is actually minor shirk.
And for context, shirk is the ultimate sin in Islamic theology. It means associating partners with God. Minor shirk specifically refers to showing off.
Okay.
So the theological argument is terrifying if you are one of these performative worshipers. When you pray just to maintain your social status in the popular group, you are no longer praying to God. You are praying to the audience. Your community has become your idol.
And the source points out that this authoritarian force isn't limited to one specific sect. It mentions this demand for blind conformity exists in strict Sharia groups and mystical Sufi groups alike.
It's everywhere.
Anywhere The leader, the sheikh, calls all the shots and simply cannot be questioned. You find this illusion of the popular group.
Because an unquestionable leader is the ultimate symptom of a community that has replaced God with a human hierarchy. If the sheikh cannot be questioned, then the sheikh has effectively taken on a divine attribute. And that is exactly what the scurvy Muslims in Cape Town were running away from.
Which brings up a critical crossroads for us. I mean, the source material talks about how some groups, like the Quranists mentioned in the text, stepped completely away from traditional structures to find freedom. It validates the scurvy Muslims who hid their practices.
Right.
So, does the reflective analysis ultimately suggest that the only way to protect your sincerity is to just abandon the structured rituals entirely, to throw the whole system out and just be a private, unscripted believer?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the text's answer is a very firm, resounding no. And this is where the synthesis of the third document is so brilliant. It specifically warns against the trap of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, the private believers were absolutely right to resist authoritarianism. But abandoning Allah or the established traditions, the Sunnah is not the cure for hollow ritual.
The analogy the text uses is beautiful. It says, the system of fixed times exists to tether us even when we are spiritually dry. That changes everything.
It really does.
You don't just pray when you feel overwhelmed with inspiration. The structure is there to hold you in place when you have absolutely nothing left in the tank. If you only rely on raw, spontaneous emotion, what happens when the emotion fades? You drift away entirely.
Precisely. The challenge laid out in the final section is not to destroy the structure, but to inhabit that structure with the deep, raw sincerity that the Cape Town reader was so desperately craving.
Yeah.
The text asks this haunting question. Can a culture be built where a person can pray in public and remain humble, and pray in private and remain unashamed?
To achieve that, the text emphasizes a concept called tadabbur, which means deep reflection. It argues that the greatest sunnah, the greatest tradition to follow, is the pursuit of understanding. Questioning the status quo, asking why we do things, shouldn't be viewed as an act of rebellion.
That completely flips the narrative of the performative group.
It really does.
The authoritarian groups view questioning as a threat to their power. The text views questioning as a religious duty. If you aren't reflecting, you are just a robot performing a script, which takes us right back to the hollow shell of a prayer.
The source material concludes with a really striking thought that redefines what it means to go astray. It argues that the loudest deviance isn't necessarily the person who struggles with their faith and stops praying.
What is it then?
The loudest deviance is praying while you are actively oppressing someone else. It's calling to God while actively driving other people away from Him through your arrogance. And it finishes with a plea from Quran 3.8. Our Lord, do not let our hearts deviate after you have guided us.
Man, it's a powerful call for relentless internal vigilance. The structure of the religion is necessary, but without constant, brutally honest self-reflection, that very structure becomes a prison.
I love how the author of the third text summarizes the original post and the Cape Town commentary. They call the combined works a mirror for the soul and a scalpel for the community.
That's a great metaphor.
Isn't it? It's incredible that the text fully validates the pain of those private, scurvy believers who are marginalized, while still insisting that the community must hold on to the rope of tradition. They phrase it so perfectly. We must hold firmly to the rope, but without turning it into a whip.
This raises an important question for anyone listening, really, regardless of your personal theological background. How do we interact with the structures, the routines, and the uniforms in our own lives? Have they become empty performances? Are we holding ropes to stay tethered? Or are we wielding whips to control the people around us?
And that is exactly why this deep dive matters for you, the listener. You might not be a theologian. You might not have any connection to the Muslim community in Cape Town. But the struggle outlined in these documents is fiercely, universally human.
Definitely.
It is the eternal, exhausting tension between living authentically and surrendering to a performative culture.
Because we see the exact same mechanisms everywhere.
We really do.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it in the workplace, where corporate jargon and visibility metrics replace actual productivity and innovation.
Oh, constantly.
You see it on social media, where people carefully curate their virtues, their outrage, and their activism just to be seen to be doing.
Yeah.
They collect their tribal badges of allegiance, while their actual offline private lives remain entirely empty of the virtues they scream about online.
It's Goodhart's law applied to the human soul. We all face the temptation to let the outward symbol do the heavy lifting, to let the uniform replace the inward reality. Because, let's be honest, it is infinitely easier to perform virtue for an audience than it is to actually cultivate it in the quiet moments of your life.
So, as we wrap up today's deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
I want to leave you with a thought to really mull over. Think about the habits, the rituals, or the routines you perform every single day to signal to the world who you are and what you value.
Mm-hmm.
Now, imagine if every single one of those outward symbols was suddenly stripped away. Imagine there was no audience, no popular group to please, no one to hand you a badge of allegiance, and absolutely no one to judge your performance. Without the uniform, without the scheduled performance review, what would the silent, unscripted version of your life actually say about what you truly believe?
When the audience leaves the theater, who are you in the dark?
Exactly. Until next time, keep digging beneath the surface.